This is one of the reasons you'll find Calvinists that sound like they're speaking like Arminians, and the very next sermon they sound like they're a hardcore Calvinist again, and you're going, how do those two things comport? David Allen, a colleague of mine and a great pastor and theologian, he says that Calvinists have the same vocabulary but a different dictionary. And that's a good explanation, because they will say things like, we believe God is sovereign. And we'll go, well, of course God is sovereign. Yeah, we agree with that. But they define sovereignty differently than most of us would define sovereignty. Mm-hmm. They define sovereignty as more of a deterministic, or that he's micromanaging all the world's decisions and actions of every single creature. And we would define sovereignty as it's defined in every dictionary. He's the king, and he has the right to rule however he pleases. But if he's pleased to give the earth over to man, as the scripture says, and to allow us to make choices that are real and sourced from us, not from his decree or from his determination, then he has every right to do that. So we actually have a higher view of sovereignty in the sense that we believe God could, if he wanted to, give us libertarian free will. And we believe that's exactly what he did according to what the scripture reveals about how he interacts with creation. Calvinist, on the other hand, believes that he's chosen to sovereignly rule a determined world, a world where he makes the choices about what people choose. So God ultimately decrees what everybody will choose before they ever choose it. And the reason they choose it ultimately is because he decreed for them to do it that way. Now, they'll throw in things about secondary causes and things like this. But in a world where God decrees all things, that includes those secondary causes. So it doesn't make any sense to say, well, he uses secondary causes, therefore determinism doesn't have a problem anymore. Of course not. It's not answering the problem, because they're just putting another domino in the stack of dominoes and saying, oh, by adding this extra domino here, now you can't object to determinism anymore. Okay, right. You just added another step in the process. You're not changing anything, because that domino you just added is still under the meticulous control of the divine decree, just as much so as the decision of the man to rape, murder, or kill.
It may even muddy the water and make it even more complicated by adding that.
Exactly. Okay. And so
I'm sorry, go right ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's the major, point of contention that we'll have is the definition of terms. Most debates need to start probably by, let's define our terms, because what do you mean by sovereignty? What do you mean by justification? What do you mean by glorification? What do you mean by so many other terms that are thrown out there? Regeneration, whether regeneration precedes faith and all the discussions that go along with that. Well, what do you mean by regeneration, first of all? Because I know of some Arminians who believe in a type of regeneration. Arminius himself talked about a type of regeneration that precedes our faith, but he wasn't talking about what most Calvinists are today. And so defining terms is really important to have a profitable conversation.
Okay, so let's circle back. We come back to, we've got Augustine, then you move forward. And like I said, and I know that I'm brushing with a very broad brush here, but it really does. There is this jump connection, Paul, Augustine, and then you jump to Calvin. And it's as if that's the stream of faith. And to hear them speak, it's as if that's the doctrines of grace. That's what it's always been. And anything else is an aberration or a phenomenal event that is outside the stream of grace. You come to Calvin, you move forward. As I look at this, when you look at this, you talk about total depravity. What are we talking about when we say that? You're suggesting they mean total inability. That's an issue. All right. The next initial thing that you come to, the decrees, the unconditional election of God. I actually saw an interview, or I saw a show where you were commenting on a guy, and the lady actually said, what would you do if one of your children were predetermined to go to hell? And the guy was like, well, I would accept that, knowing that God is wise and good. I mean, it took your breath away. And when I watched it, it took me away. How can they make that leap? How is that leap being made in a rational mind? Is they adding a grid over top of Scripture? Is it some of that Gnosticism that has come in? That only a few? How do you think they're making these big leaps? Because they're huge leaps.
Yeah. Well, I can only speak for myself, and I held to Calvinism for about 10 years of my life. I was probably a softer, more of a John MacArthur kind of Calvinist, early John MacArthur. MacArthur has, with age, I think, become harder in his Calvinism. which is typical, by the way. If you study most Calvinists, they'll become more and more consistent with their Calvinism and less consistent, in my estimation, with the Bible. And,
Matt, I want to ask, why do you think that is? What, as you look at that from a biblical side?
I think it's logical consistency. I think once people are pressed on certain logical points, many points that I didn't think through when I was in my 20s holding to Calvinism, that once you begin to play it out and you begin to look at the logical implication of this claim must be this, and I don't hold to this. Limited atonement is one of those. It's a doctrine in search of a text. There's no text that says that God only dies for a pre-select group of people or something of that nature. It's always spoken of in universal terms, not only to you, but for the sins of the entire world, it even says in 1 Timothy 2. And so the limited atonement folks are really basing upon logical implications, because if God picked a certain number of people, and only a certain number of people who he picked are going to be saved through irresistible means, then it only makes sense that he's going to die for those people, and only those people. I mean, why would you have a universal atonement if you're the ones ultimately deciding who will and won't accept and benefit from that atonement? And so there's a lot of those kinds of logical implications, some of which Calvinists are willing to accept, and some of which they will just appeal to mystery to or deny altogether. And then just accept the antinomy, as J.I. Packer refers to it as, which is defined as a contradiction. Now he will redefine it in his work, saying, well, because it's theology, it's not an actual contradiction. God doesn't contradict himself, but it's an apparent contradiction. It seems to be a contradiction from our limited, finite mind, but it is true, and thus we must accept it. And so it becomes a form of doublespeak. It becomes a form. This is one of the reasons you'll find Calvinists that sound like they're speaking like Arminians and non-Calvinists in one sermon, and the very next sermon they sound like they're a hardcore Calvinist again. And you're going, how do those two things comport? Well, because they hold to this contradiction, this antinomy. They believe on the one hand you're responsible and you make choices, and you're in time you're doing all these things that are real, and it's your choice, and you must come to Christ for salvation. And on this other hand, they're going to teach that God meticulously controls every thought, action, and deed of man. He's the one who's decreed everything that you'll say and do. He's sovereign, defined as deterministic over everything. And so you'll have both of those seemingly contradictory concepts just being taught, depending on what verse they're teaching from. And you're asking, how do those comport?
I've heard little, cliches or things like that, where it's you've got both two sides to the bank that keep the river flowing, and in heaven the mystery unites. But it still doesn't really answer the question that we're dealing with right here, in the sense that when you get right down to it, one of the things that struck me about the books when I was reading is the prolific amount of scripture that you use. Obviously, you're quoting other sources and things like that. But when we get to the heart, and I'm not trying to be uncharitable to other men that believe differently, but when we get to the heart of what you're talking about, we are talking about a scriptural issue, not just a difference of opinion. We are talking about a radical difference of what saith the Lord. Would you agree with that? And is that really the heart of what we're dealing with?
Absolutely. It is what does the Bible say about this? And of course, when I was a Calvinist, I believed the Bible taught Calvinism. And the reason I taught Calvinistic theology is because I thought it was biblical theology. And I believe every Calvinist that I've ever debated or talked through about this, it feels the same way. That's why I don't treat them like they're my enemy. I realize I think they're making an honest mistake, and hopefully that's what they think about me. I don't have to assume a nefarious motive in order to disagree with a brother. I think they have taken a text and they have misread it and misunderstood it in the same way that I once did. And so my approach to someone who I think is making a mistake, it's much different than the approach of somebody who I think is purposely deceiving people or trying to make the Bible say something they know it's not saying. And some people approach Calvinists that way, just like some people approach Arminians or Provisionists that way. They just assume, oh, this is a sneaky snake who's trying to take over the church and who's trying to deceive people to believe the wrong doctrine. That's not necessarily the case. There may be some like that out there. But I think most people are well-intending Christians who are just honestly trying to portray God as he portrays himself through Scripture. But I think that they're making interpretive mistakes.